All right, my friend, we've learned what context is and why we use it. So now we can create a context for this application. All right, let's set it up. So we have these two components, navbar and to-do list, right? Now what I'd like to do is use some shared data inside these components. And of course, we're going to use more components a little bit later on because we're going to create a whole lot more in the future. Okay, so the data that we're going to use is, well, it's all going to be about the theme of the application. So, is it a light theme or is it a dark theme? We'll create a context called theme context in order to figure this out. First of all, I'm going to create a new folder under the src directory, and this will be called contexts, because I want to keep all of the different context files in one place, and it's going to be in this folder. I just like to keep things organized. All right, so now I can create a new file, and I'll call this themecontext.js, because our context is going to be related to theme. So now inside this file, this is where we're going to create our theme context. So the first thing that we'll need to do inside this file is to import React. So I'm just going to say import React from React. And we'll also need to import create context as well. So this is a function which is going to, create a context for us. So I'm going to say export const, because ultimately we are going to export this context. And I'm going to call this context theme context. You can call it whatever you like. And I'm going to set it equal to create context and invoke that function. So this is going to create a context for us, and it's going to be stored in this constant theme context. Right now, it's not going to do a whole lot on its own. We've not defined any data for this context, and we certainly haven't provided it to the different components. So at the minute, it's not doing nothing. It's just kind of hanging out. So what we're going to do now, though, is create another component, which will be a class component. And then inside that component, we're going to have some states. And that state will be the data that we want to share between the different components. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. First of all, I'm going to say class theme context provider extends react.component. And then I will open up a set of curly braces. So I call this component theme context provider. You can call it whatever you like again. And I normally call it whatever the context is called, and then I'll just put provider on the end. I just like to, keep it simple. But anyway, inside of here, this is where we want to state, and this is going to be shared data that we want to supply to the different components. So I'll just say state equal to, and open up a set of curly braces, and we will add some state property in just a minute. But for now, let's create a render method. And inside the render method, I will say return. And we will return context provider here. Okay, so let's go ahead and export this component. So let's say export default theme context provider. Okay, so we have state here, and we will keep all the data. That's all the data that we want to use in our application inside this state. So we'll have a few different properties inside this state. But first of all, I'll create a property called isDarkTheme, and that's going to be a Boolean, so true or false. I'll set it to true to begin with, and this is going to determine whether we are going to be using the dark theme or not. So if it's true, then we will use the dark theme. If it's false, we will use the light theme. Okay, so we also want another couple of properties, one for light theme and one for dark theme, which are going to be two different objects with different properties describing the colors of those themes. So let's create a property called light theme, which is an object. And the first property inside of this will be the text. And this property will specify the color of the text in the light theme. We'll set that to a color 222, which is kind of like a black. It's just going to be for all the text inside the app. Alrighty, then the other property is going to be background. And as you probably guess, it's going to be the background of the light theme. So that means we'll set this equal to hash D8DDF1. And it's kind of a light blue. Okay, so for the dark theme, we have the same properties as well. So let's say dark theme. And open up an object again. And for the text, we'll say hash FFF. So the text is going to be white in the dark theme. And for the background, we'll say hash 5C, 5C, 5C. So that makes it kind of a dark gray, right? So we have our state now, and this is the data that we want to provide to two different components and share between them, right? So now that we have that, we will need to provide this data to the different components. And those components are these two. Remember, navbar and to-do list. So when we create a context, we have to also create a provider, which is basically a tag that surrounds whichever components we want to be able to use that context inside. In our case, we want to use context data inside the navbar and the to-do list components. So we should provide the data to these components. Okay, so in our theme context file, what we need to do is return a bit of JSX, a template which is going to contain that theme context. And we'll call it provider tag. Provider is provided by the context itself. So inside of here, we'll do a tag called theme context.provider, like so. So whenever we create a context like this, we're going to give this thing the provider on that context. And this is, well, ultimately the thing that's going to wrap our different components so that the data can be used inside of these specific components. All right, so let's take a break right here. And then when we come back to the next lesson, we're going to provide this context data to our components. See you then.